So these are things that were very important. Again, another way to tell a church, maybe there's some other ways to learn about things. And Galileo was also able to see that the Milky Way was comprised of many, many planets and stars. Okay. Now, the next unit that we talk about is, let me see if there's anything I have on here. Okay, is the search for spices. And we know that spices played a big part in the economy of many countries, especially countries like Spain and Portugal. And these spices came from the East Indies, which is present-day Indonesia, New Guinea, and India. So why were spices so important? Well, first of all, they were a way to preserve meat and food because they didn't have refrigerators or any other way to keep things from spoiling. Secondly, a lot of people ate things that were kind of spoiling anyway, but to hide the bad taste, they seasoned them with as much spices as they could get to hide that flavor. Sounds kind of yucky, right? But that's the way it was. So the Italian traders got the spices and traveled across the Mediterranean, sold the spices. They bought them for a certain amount of money, but not too much, but for 40 times what they paid. So think about the Italians and the Portuguese and the Spanish who are looking for trade routes to increase their spice trade. They want to make that 40% markup so that their country can make a lot of money. One of the things that they kept trying to do is to find a shorter route to Asia so that they could get these spices more easily and quickly. One of the terrible parts about the spice trade was that there became something called the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage involves getting spices, bringing products to areas to get spices, pick them up, and also pick up Africans from Africa as slaves. And why would this be good? Because then they could sell those slaves and get money as well. So the African slave trade involved the transportation by slave traders of African people to the Americas. Now, not so much in North America at this time. There's some that are coming to North America, but mainly they're going to areas like in Latin America, that sort of area. But those are the Americas, North and South America. And they use that passageway where they come, they stop at Africa, they trade, they pick up Africans, they sail across to the Americas, they sell those slaves, they take the money and their things back, and they have spices and money, and then it starts again. They bring their goods that they're going to sell down to Africa, they sell that, they get their spices into the East, they sell this, they take the slaves, and it goes back and forth. And it's called Middle Passage because it's between the continents of North and South America and Asia and Africa. And it was a terrible time. Slaves were packed into ships where they could barely move, were given very little to eat, were treated very poorly. There was disease that was rampant on these boats, okay? There were no toilets, there were no places for them to relieve themselves. They ate in the same area that they used as a bathroom, okay? Sometimes there were slave revolts on the ships, but many times they were not. They were brought across, and if they did live through the passage, they were sold and treated terribly and had no rights of their own. So the African slave trade started during the search for spices. So this semester we talked about 3 revolutions. We talked about the Enlightenment, okay? We talked about American Revolution, and we talked about the French Revolution. And all of these things come from the idea of the Reformation, okay, where and the Renaissance, where rebirth and change of ideas starts to grow. What was the Enlightenment? It's called the Age of Reason. Enlightenment, Age of Reason. What does that mean? It means people now are thinking for themselves. And that started with that humanism movement that we talked about. And the Enlightenment was a revolution, and it went through all areas, and it made people consciously think and reason, okay? Not just be told what to do, right? And it represents an intellectual history in Europe. And philosophers in France were very important during this time. And we had Voltaire, a French philosopher, and Montesquieu, another French philosopher, and Rousseau. And outside of France, there were also philosophers that were becoming very famous, and people were thinking about what they're saying and listening to them. And it even gets to the part where in the United States, Thomas Jefferson, okay, is a philosopher and an economist. He too is using this reasoning technique at this time. In French, this Enlightenment is called the Siècle de Lumière. Okay, that means the century of enlightenment, or the century of light, lumière. Okay, lumière, light, right? Ding, the light bulb goes off and they say, hey, wait, let's question that. I'm not sure if that's right. So the ideas about art and politics and philosophy are all coming into play, and people are thinking about how things should be, how they should look. Why do we think this way? Should we think that way? So when we look about the Enlightenment, we find out there are goals for humanity: knowledge, freedom, and happiness. Okay, so those are important goals during the Enlightenment. And remember, again, the church is slowly losing more and more of its power. Does it mean people aren't praying and worshiping God? They are. But now they're beginning to realize that there are other ways to determine why things are the way they are, and that they too are like a blank slate. And the more they learn, the more control they have over who they are and what they'll be. The Renaissance had people that were thinking back to the Greek philosophers of Aristotle and Plato. Okay, so things are going back and forth like that. So the Renaissance and the Reformation are periods of change that make the world into the world that we know today. People are thinking for themselves, they're thinking about themselves. And it's, if you can reason and do it in an orderly way, you will be successful. At this time, Isaac Newton, you know, the one where the apple falls to the ground, you know, and they say, oh, it falls to the ground because of gravity. Well, he's a mathematician. And he comes up with some very famous mathematical equations that explain many of the things that happen in the world. The movement of the planets, okay? Why time works the way it does. The Enlightenment produced modern theories. John Locke reviewed that a person's mind, John Locke, very famous, okay, was a blank slate, like I said, and where experience could write itself on your mind, meaning that you learn by doing, you learn by seeing, you learn by listening. You can also learn by following, but the other parts are important, or more important than just being the follower. These important ideas were in France, in England, and in America. Now let's talk about another revolution. We talked about the American Revolution, and I know a lot of you know about that. And this takes place when the English colonists in the New World begin to realize that the mother country, Great Britain or England, is now not treating them fairly. they are beginning to have to pay taxes on many things. There's a stamp tax that's put on documents and papers that are drawn up. Anytime they want something that's coming over from England that they don't have here in the colonies, they're paying a tax. And to tell you the truth, if England had given them a right to speak their mind or to have a say in Parliament or in any law body, they might have gone along with this. But this is when we hear no taxation without representation. Remember, taxation without representation means that you do not have the right to vote on certain things or have your say to make a decision on how things work out. So the American colonies begin to start a war with Britain after they receive a tax on tea. Now remember, tea is the drink that everybody wants because they've come from England and that's what they drank there. We have no tea plantations here at this time, okay? We don't grow tea leaves. That has to come over from Great Britain. And Great Britain says, you got to pay a tax on it. Well, this so angers the colonists that they have a meeting, and it's very secretive, and they know that there is a huge ship in the port in Boston, Massachusetts, that is laden, is holding many, many bales of tea. So at night, they disguise themselves as Indians, as Native Americans. At that time, they were called Indians, so that they couldn't be identified. And they board the ship and they throw the tea into the water. And it said they dumped the tea into the sea, okay? And this is their protest against the taxes on tea. Well, guess what? England is really ticked off at this. So they start to put these acts on them. They take the rights of the Massachusetts Bay Colony to govern itself away. And things are just horrible for the colonists. And they say, enough is enough. We're not going to deal with this anymore. And that's when we start the beginnings of the American Revolution. So we're at the beginning of the Revolution. We have Britain, Great Britain, or England. The people who are on that side are known as the Tories. Okay, the Tories. They're also known as the Redcoats because they wear red jackets when they go into battle, which makes it very easy for people to see them and shoot them. But back then they didn't realize that. They wanted to look proud and strong, and red was a strong color. So Redcoats are Tories for the British. If you were from the colonies, okay, you were called a patriot. Okay, the patriots were from the colonies. And the tensions began in Concord, Massachusetts in 1775, when the British confront the colonists, and a battle starts at Lexington and Concord, and a shot is fired and the war starts. The Patriots said that King George II only wanted to take the rights of the colonists away. King George II also wanted to get as much money as he could for England. So the colonists rejected the monarchy, and the Revolutionary War begins. The Declaration of Independence is drawn up during this time in Philadelphia, and it is signed and ratified in 1776, and it proclaims that all men are created equal. Okay, so let's see what we have here. And then you can look at some of your other videos that we've seen on that. So let's think about, as they fight this, okay, in the American Revolution, the commander is George Washington. And he, of course, becomes the first president of the United States after the Revolution. And there are very many battles all along. But we also get some help from the French, from Lafayette. And the colonists prevail and they become their own nation. So let's think a little bit about the next part of revolutions. So there's also a French Revolution that comes along. And the French Revolution is involved with people who are trying to get some rights in France because the rulers are so horrible to the common everyday people that they are starving, they're put in jail, they don't have any rights. So it's a political revolution for social change in France. And if you've seen the play or the movie Les Miserables, this is the French Revolution, okay? Where you have to steal a loaf of bread to feed your family, and then you can go to jail for the rest of your life over a loaf of bread, okay? So some of the central ideas were life, liberty, and the pursuit, and fraternity, okay, brotherhood. That was 3 of the ideas for the French Revolution, and they wanted the rights and freedom for everyone, okay? That's why they fight in this revolution. And Louis XVI needed to raise money, so he raised a lot of taxes on the people. Sound familiar? Same thing going on in England. And the people couldn't pay them. They didn't want to pay them. They couldn't pay them. They were starving. So this turned into a huge protest in France. And the French Revolution was an uprising in France against the king, which resulted in France turning into a republic instead of being a dictatorship. Okay. It was very, very violent. There were riots, there were executions, there were many beheadings of people during that time. But all in all, a French military person named Napoleon Bonaparte comes into play. And he is the one who can slowly move the revolution, the French Revolution movement into a direction where the war ends and life starts to get better for those people in France. And before they were ruled by kings and the Catholic Church, and now the people have a say in their life. Okay. So this caused more stability in France. People began to see their rights coming back. People were beginning to have a say in government, and things start to calm down. And Napoleon is said to be one of the stabling forces that caused this to happen. Okay, so we had the American Revolution. Okay, we had the French Revolution. And now in the United States, it's time for the Industrial Revolution. Remember the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution starts when factories begin to operate in the United States. People have mainly been living in farms and in rural areas. They produce everything they need. They grow their own crops for food. They have their own animals for food, for meat, for sheep or lamb, for wool to make clothing. They get water from the springs on their land. They build their houses with the trees that are there. They heat their houses with whatever they have, whether it's wood or dung from animals or hay. Okay, they do all of these things, and they usually have fairly big families because they need the kids to help out. So the Industrial Revolution is going to start, and this is when people began to leave the rural areas and move into the cities. Okay, and that starts from about 1750 to 1850, and we're talking about agricultural societies that are now becoming more industrialized and more urban. Well, what's the draw for coming to this city? The draw is that there are a lot of jobs available in the factories, and people can make money there, and people need money to live. The Industrial Revolution is a great time, okay? Some of the things that happened during that time is the first transcontinental railroad is built. The first railroad that connects the East Coast of the United States with the West Coast. And this is done through many laborers that come over from Europe on the East Coast and from China on the West Coast. And they work very hard under very difficult situations and dangerous situations to build this railroad that crosses from one side to the other. We also see the cotton gin. The cotton gin is now a machine that separates the seeds in the cotton from the cotton itself that then can be spun and used to make cloth. All right, so that's very important, the cotton gin. And also there's some electricity coming on at this time, which makes things a lot easier as well. There are 4 stages. There's the first industrial revolution when it just starts and it's replacing the agriculture and people are coming to the country. Then we have the second industrial revolution. That's around 1870. And that's when technology is beginning to really take on, and it's the most important part of the Industrial Revolution. There are new sources for energy, there's electricity, there's gas, oil, and then the inventions that come because of that are the internal combustion engine, right? There's the development of steel to make things stronger. Communications like the telegraph and then the telephone come in. So people can send messages back and forth to each other and find out things a lot quicker than, say, the Pony Express, where someone has to ride it, a message, in a mail bag from one place to another place, and then somebody else picks it up. So all of the things that we take for granted today are starting to come to play in the second part of the Industrial Revolution. And then we have also cars are starting. Not a lot of people have them, but with the internal combustion engine, they're able to have that. The last part of the Industrial Revolution is where we are today, the third part of the Industrial Revolution, where telecommunications starts. We have computers, we have electronics. That's the third part, okay? So this opened doors for research, this opened doors for people to produce more, was a very, very famous big thing that happens. However, people are working in factories. Factories have no safety mechanisms at all. It is not unusual for someone to lose their hand or their arm. Sometimes a sleeve on something will catch into the machine, pull it, and yank off someone's arm. In the one video I showed you, it talked about a young child because children were working in the factories because, first of all, their parents had to work. There was no place to put them. Okay, they didn't have daycare, and there weren't too many people who couldn't afford to work, could not afford to work. So they took them along. They made a meager wage. And in one of the videos that I showed you, it said that the small child had been sucked into the machine at the factory. They heard the child screaming and all of its bones and all was spit out. Disgusting and horrible. But these were not unusual events. I showed you the video about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where women and children were working in this factory, and it was considered a pretty high-end job for a factory worker. They got paid more than a lot of other places, and people really wanted to work there because they needed the money. And on one day, they go to work, and someone has complained that factory workers are sneaking out for a cigarette or going out earlier. So they have locked the doors. They've locked the doors from the outside so that people can't get out. And a fire starts, I believe, on the 6th floor. And it quickly spreads with all the fabric and the dust and the thread all over. And the people can't get out. And they die in this factory. And people are so moved by the fact that people were treated so poorly that at first they don't even bury their dead. They lay them out on the street in blankets and caskets for people to see what really happened. And these terrible, unfair practices of poor wages, no health benefits, working many, many hours, 6 days, 7 days a week, are going to stop because Samuel Gompers comes along with a group of his men and he decides that he's going to form the first union, the AFL. The AFL is the American Federation of Labor. And what does this union do? Well, the first thing it does is try to stop unfair practices against people. It says that workers can only work 6 days a week, not 7 days a week, and that they can complain about conditions to their bosses without fear of losing their job. They also talk about safety features that are put in to keep people from losing their arm or their hand or whatever, or from getting hurt. But on top of that, they start to put into an institution of workers the belief that they have rights, and that if they are hurt on the job, the people at work should pay to help the injured party get better. Okay, so that's a compensation that they receive. So they demanded better working conditions, higher wages, fewer work hours, again, medical treatment for those who were injured on the job, and vacation days. Don't think you got 5 days vacation or 2 weeks vacation or a month's vacation, maybe a day's vacation, okay? But they worked up to it slowly. Women were having a real hard time during this time because they had to go out to work, but they also had to come home and take care of the house, take care of their husband, and take care of their children. Many of them felt that they were working from the minute the sun went up to the minute the sun went down. Okay, and then during the night. So cutting back on some of these hours was going to help for them as well. A standard of living is slowly starting to change. The wealthy are living very well, as they always did, but slowly the tenements, the slums where these people who have moved in from the countryside are living, they're just horrible. But slowly laws start to get passed. The tenements were very overcrowded. Some of the rooms had no windows. They were shared by all kinds of family members because no one could afford anything else. There were terrible fires that took place. There's no indoor plumbing. Many times the courtyard between, or the alleyway between the buildings, was used for the public toilet. So what happens again? There's disease, people are dying. So things start to change. And so what happens is tenement houses that were so overcrowded are now going to change. And there's the 1905 Tenement House Act that's put in. And it says that there has to be windows in each room. So it provides first ventilation for fresh air, and second, light. Because a lot of people didn't have electricity at this time. So you have no ventilation, and maybe you have a candle, or you have some kind of kerosene. Well, those are things that can start a fire very easily as well. And there should be outward facing windows in all the rooms and indoor toilets of some type. Okay. And also fire extinguishers, some sort of extinguisher, ability to put out some fires that could start. All right. So that was the Tenement House Act. And that was the first Tenement House Act. All right, so now we move on. Now we talk about World War I. And it was World War I, the war to end all wars. And there were two sides on this. So let's go and let's just talk a little bit about this. It starts with the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And he's assassinated, and then there are other things going on. There's a lot of nationalism going on in countries. Each country is very proud. They're building up their military to the biggest extent that they can. They're forming alliances with other countries so that they can have strength. All right. And with these big armies and with all of this thought of nationalism, certain countries are beginning to think that perhaps they can control a lot more than they have. And so Austria, Hungary, and Serbia wanted to be independent. France wanted Alsace-Lorraine back from Germany. Nations had hope that they were stronger than they were, and the alliances were becoming, were forming. So here in 1914, the 6 most powerful countries in Europe are starting to form alliances. That means sides. They were joining sides. The Triple Alliance consisted of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Okay, Triple Alliance. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. The Axis powers, remember we're talking about the areas in Europe and part of Asia because Russia's in there, are Britain, France, and Russia. And they're all distrusting one another, and they all think the other's going to try to take over their country. And with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, the war begins. During this time, the idea to protect your soldiers was decided that trenches, ditches in the ground were built to protect the soldiers from firing from the other side. Remember, in the Revolutionary War, they tend to have an idea of walking up to each other and firing on each other, right, like this. But now trenches are being dug to help with the bombings that go on and the shooting. If you look at the trenches that were dug in some areas, like for England, they were poorly dug. And they were set up in such a way that when it rained, the water would fill in these trenches. They'd be filling up with water. They couldn't keep their clothes dry. Their feet were always wet. Their weaponry and their ammunition was always wet. They got trench foot because their feet were soaking, their socks, their shoes. It caused amputations. It was horrible. On top of that, it would wash the feces that was in areas near them into the trenches. Rats would come, lice would come. There was a lot of sickness and illness. It was just horrible. So we saw that the Germans, on the other hand, dug and they were very methodical. They dug trenches that were deep, and some of them had coverings on some areas, and they were raised above the regular part of the trench. So if water came in, their soldiers were dry because they felt that this was going to be a more permanent place for their soldiers, while the Russians and the British thought it was very temporary. So they didn't spend a lot of time in doing that. So the war goes on. It is terribly bloody. All right, it's terribly bloody. At one point, the German Navy goes on strike. They say, enough, we're not doing it anymore. The people in Germany are saying, when we don't want this war anymore, it has to stop. It has to stop. And finally, it does. And that's when the Treaty of Versailles is signed. Now, the Treaty of Versailles is one of the things that causes a lot of problems in history. And the Treaty of Versailles is started by leaders of the U.S., Great Britain, and France, because the U.S. is in the war as well at that point. And they're going to go to Versailles, which is in France, and they're going to make a treaty that ends World War II. However, they do not invite Austria-Hungary, and they do not invite Italy, and they do not invite the Germans. And that makes them humiliated. They're already defeated, but now they feel even worse. The Treaty of Versailles outlines the fact that the Germans can no longer have an army bigger than 1,000 men, 100,000 men. I'm sorry, 100,000 men. They cannot have any more submarines because submarines were very important during the war. They sunk many boats. During World War I. Also during World War I, Germany was able to invade many countries. And at that time, they took over different parts of countries and claimed them for Germany. The Treaty of Versailles said that all lands that were won by Germany had to be given back to whoever they belonged to. For instance, the Alsace-Lorraine area belonged to France, and they wanted it back. Germany also had to pay large amounts of money as restitution to build back areas that were destroyed during the war. Paying this restitution to the Axis powers and their countries made Germany very poor. The people of Germany were defeated, humiliated, angry, okay? And the way this treaty was drawn up caused extreme hard feelings. And it was said that that treaty never let World War I end. And why was that? Well, it was because the people were so downhearted and so upset that when someone like Adolf Hitler comes and he starts to rise to power and he preaches what the Germans want to hear, that they can be the top again, they can be strong, they can have a strong military, they're going to have a superior race, they're going to get rid of people who they think are inferior. And that includes the Jews, homosexuals, it includes gypsies and anyone who's against the Third Reich, that they will kill them. And there are concentration camps built, and there's annihilation of thousands and thousands of people, especially Jews. All of their property and belongings are stolen. Okay, so this again is a horrible time. At this time, though, okay, we're looking at who's in what area. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happens with World War II as it starts. Okay, World War II starts when Germany invades Poland, and that's in 1939. It's easy. Poland has a weak army. It doesn't really have a strong military, and the country is easily taken over. Once this happens, England and France declare war on Germany. The United States is not in World War II at this time. Fighting continues. Countries like Norway are taken over. They take over and move into France. Italy is ruled by Mussolini. He is on the side of the Germans. The Germans have their leader, Adolf Hitler. We have Churchill for England, and we have Charles de Gaulle for France. So there's bloody fighting going on all over, and slowly the Germans are taking over different areas. They even are moving into areas in Africa. The Allied powers, which are led by, again, Winston Churchill for Britain, Joseph Stalin for Russia, and Charles de Gaulle from France, and later Franklin Delano Roosevelt from the United States, are against the Axis powers. And the Axis powers are Germany, Italy, and Japan. Okay? Not until Japan does a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in the United States does the United States enter the war. The United States is in negotiations with Japan the very time that the Japanese invade the military post at Pearl Harbor, the base at Pearl Harbor. They are in competition with the United States for areas in the Pacific that they want to control. And they feel that the only threat that they have is this naval base in Hawaii, because that brings them fairly close to Japan. So they send out ships and planes, and they come over Pearl Harbor and they bomb because there are a lot of boats and ships that are important to and planes to the military. And it cripples the United States for a small time, for a certain time. But at that time, and you saw the video I showed you, where President Franklin Delano Roosevelt says, "This day will go down in infamy. It'll be famous. No one will ever forget this sneak attack, this terrible attack on the Americans." And this is a speech that he gives to unite the United States, who has been desperately trying to stay out of World War II, right? Desperately trying to stay out. But now the United States has been hit themselves. Japan figures that with this hit, even though some of their ships, US ships weren't there, that this will disable the United States so much so that they won't be a force to reckon with, but they were wrong. The United States enters the war and they become strong, very strong. They are fighting in two fronts. They are fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, but they've also joined the fight against Germany and Europe in the Asian theater. And of course, England is very worried because they're afraid that their country will fall. The one thing that saves them somewhat is that they're separated by the water. So that makes a little bit of a difference. But the Germans are trying very hard to infiltrate England. Together with France and with Russia and with Great Britain and the United States, they fight strongly together. And Adolf Hitler makes a very bad mistake at this time. He decides that it might be nice to go in the other direction too and conquer some land. So he decides to go towards Russia. Well, the winters are brutal. There's a scarcity of food. The soldiers are ill prepared to fight the war against the Russians. They don't have the right clothes. They're freezing. And that's when Russia comes on hard, and the Germans are getting hit on the other front, on the west front, from the east and from the west, okay? And they're losing. At which time Berlin is bombed and Germany's going to lose the war. And as you see in one of the videos I show you, 2 days before the war is declared over in Europe, Adolf Hitler kills himself in his bunker. The war continues in the Pacific against the Japanese. It's very bloody. Slowly, the US is taking over one island after another, but not the most strongly defended islands at first. They feel that if they can get a number of islands, at least they can have some places to land their planes and bring their ships. Because remember, it's a long way from California to go over to Japan. So they need like an in-between place. There's 2 battles that come on during this time, and that's going to be, these are battles that are for fighting for areas, Hiroshima and Okinawa, where the United States can make a small like base, a landing field, so that they can bring fuel and things over there. Planes from California can land, refuel, they could get their food and more ammunition or whatever they need, and then go on and fight in Japan. And that's exactly what the US did. They were able to conquer Hiroshima and Okinawa, and those became bases, air bases for the United States during World War II. Again, the Japanese were trying very hard and were fighting very valiantly. But during this time, little did they realize that the United States was studying and developing an atomic bomb. And the atomic bomb was ready. And Theodore Roosevelt does talk to the other leaders in France and also in England, and says, I think that if we drop this bomb on Hiroshima, it will finally stop the Japanese from fighting. And they do. They drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It devastates everyday people, not just places where it's a military base. The atomic bomb with its radiation not only kills people at first, but people have severe burns from the radiation, and they have radiation poisoning, and they die slowly afterwards, terrible deaths. But then a second bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. And when it is dropped, that's just too overwhelming for the Japanese. And they, at that point, surrender. And the war is over in the Pacific. So the Japanese surrendered to the Allies on August 15th. And they believe that even if the bomb wasn't dropped, eventually Japan would be the loser in the battle. But so many more lives would have been lost, and it would have gone on so much longer. So they decided to drop that bomb. Whether it was a good idea or not, I won't go into that. But I do want to make sure that I've covered everything that's on your test. So far, looking at my notes, everything you need to know is going to be in this lecture. It will also be on your review sheet. Again, I hope that some of you will be coming to our welcoming event tomorrow at the Long Island campus, and also to have a nice lunch, a barbecue lunch. And hopefully you can come and talk to us about what's going on for the next semester. All right. So enjoy your week, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow if you're able to come. Thank you.